My Govanen, everybody. This is the Tolkien Geek as usual for the Tolkien Lore channel, and today I am joined by a guest, Vyacheslav Stepanov, who is in my Discord. And many of you may remember that not too long ago I did a video which I titled something along the lines of How Tolkien Almost Ruined His Own Mythology. Uh, a somewhat provocative title. Um, and in that video, I made it kind of clear that my opinion on the whole thing is that I kind of like the fact that the Silmarillion we actually got from Christopher Tolkien has uh, the sun and the moon as later creations after the trees. But the point of the video was that there was a period of time where Tolkien was considering doing something entirely different, which was making Middle Earth cosmology completely in line with actual scientific cosmology for our own world. Well, what happened was Vyacheslav hit me up on my Discord, and he actually pointed out that he had written up a paper on evidence that Tolkien was probably sticking to this idea pretty much all the way to the end of his life, with a lot of very late references and even some that were earlier than some of the stuff that's in Morgoth's Ring, which is where a lot of that stuff is found. So he mentioned me doing a video on this and kind of sharing this, and I felt bad doing it and not involving him in some way. So here we are. Would you like to introduce yourself just a little bit in terms of like your history with Tolkien and how you got interested in him and that kind of stuff?
Sure. I first read The Hobbit in my childhood. I do not remember exactly how old I was at that point, but what I remember clearly is the fact that I first read The Lord of the Rings when I was something like 8 or 9 years old.
Quick note, after recording, he contacted me to correct the age at which he read Lord of the Rings. He said it was actually around 11, 8, and 9 was when he first read Harry Potter.
And before that point, I was very interested in Harry Potter. My mother thought that I was too interested in it, obsessed with it. So to distract me, she gave me The Lord of the Rings, and you see, it worked. But by that point, I have also learned Quenya and Sindarin, Tolkien's two most elaborate Elvish languages. I am a member of the Vinja Lampen Discord community. So yes, Tolkien's languages is probably my main area of interest in Tolkien's creation. But as you see, I am also interested in the law, and particularly I came to be interested in Tolkien's late cosmology.
How did you hit on that whole topic in the first place? What was it that kind of clued you into the fact that there might be more to this than just kind of the stuff that most of the people who have read Morgoth's Ring can pick up on?
It all began about 2 years ago when reading the last volumes of the history of Middle Earth. um, I came to realize, I came to doubt one statement that I used to hear at that time and that I still sometimes hear. It is the statement that Tolkien uh, tinkered with this new cosmology for some time, but then abandoned it because he was unable to reconcile his existing legends with it. And I came to doubt it because one particular argument for this alleged abandonment of the round world cosmology was the reference to the change of the world in last writings, the writings from the last year of Tolkien's life. And then when I was reading Morgoth's Ring, um, uh, uh, particularly text 11 of Myths Transformed concerning Aman and the rate of life growth there, I realized the reference to the change of the world in these exact words in this text, and later also in another text of Myths Transformed, the seventh one. So I noticed, I was like, wait, but isn't this wording, doesn't this wording imply the previously flat Earth becoming round? And I could only make the conclusion that it does not necessarily imply this. Um, as I write in my article, um, it evidently can simply imply the removal of Aman from the physical world. And there is a text in the Nature of Middle-earth which deals with this problem. So from that point onwards, I began to notice and collect any references to the round world cosmology in Tolkien's late texts. And my purpose in the beginning wasn't even related to defending this cosmology. I merely wanted to find out the truth. But then I gradually became fond of this cosmology.
Yeah, well, I can definitely see like how you got there. I mean, like a lot of the stuff that's in the paper, which by the way will be linked in the description under the video. Um, a lot of the references that you come up with in there are things that if you just casually read the story wouldn't necessarily make a mark on your mind, but if you're paying attention to it, thinking of it, if you're reading the story looking for the references, you'll know that wait a minute, that only makes sense in this version of the story. So and so I kind of want to talk about a few of those. Some of the ones that you mentioned earlier in the paper are things that you know uh, you might tend to try to dismiss in some way because it's like maybe there's just one or two times where Tolkien slipped up. Like I think one of the ones you mentioned was one of the names for the Elvish letters means sunlight, and of course it can't have been created after the exile of the Noldor because the alphabet was in place before that. So clearly there had to be some notion of sunlight. And given that Tolkien was extremely obsessed about languages, you might tend to say, well, I mean, he was just coming up with languages and he wasn't thinking that carefully. Now that would be a dangerous thing to assume about Tolkien because he was seemingly always thinking pretty carefully. Uh, but there's a whole lot of these seemingly innocuous ones, but then there's several of them that I think are just extremely telling. And I think for my money, the most profound one was the one that changed in the third edition of The Hobbit. You want to explain that one?
Yes. So The Hobbit, as originally written, um, the chapter Flies and Spiders uh, describe the history of the branches of the Elven kin. And there is a sentence which okay, that passage first speaks of the light elves, the deep elves, and the sea elves who went to Valinor and dwelt there for ages. So, of course, what is meant is the Vanyar, the Noldor, and the Teleri. And then the passage proceeds to say that in the wide world, that is in Middle Earth, In the wide world, the wood elves lingered in the twilight. The original version says, in the twilight before the rising of the sun and moon. But the revised reading in the third edition of The Hobbit, that is 1966, in this version of the text, this sentence was revised to read, in the wide world, the wood elves lingered in the twilight of our sun and moon, but loved best the stars. Um, and of course, the twilight of our sun and moon implies the existence of the sun and moon. And if we are to discuss this more deeply, I also think that these description, the twilight of our sun and moon, probably refers to the idea of the darkening of the world by Morgoth, which entered in the texts of Myths Transformed, but also appears in later texts, particularly in in a text concerning the making of Lembas from 1968, which was published in the Nature of Middle-earth, which says that the Western corn of which Lembas was made diminished in virtue due to dim sunlight during the Great Journey.
Right, and that's a reference to basically Morgoth doing kind of what Sauron did later on in the Third Age, creating lots of volcanic ash and stuff covering up the sunlight. Um, and
Yeah,
just for context, for those who aren't super familiar with Tolkien's biography, he dies in 1973. So 1968 is within 5 years of his death. So he's, at least as late as that, seemingly still in that kind of category. And I think the reason I find the change in the Hobbit so significant is not only what you mentioned, but also the fact that the original says, that it was the twilight before the sun and moon, and then he cuts that and changes it to the twilight of our sun and moon. And why would you change that particular wording in that particular way unless you were reversing the whole idea of the sun and moon being later inventions? So that, to me, it's hard to make much sense of that any other way. So I found that one particularly interesting, and it's not the only one that seems pretty powerful, but uh, I liked it for that reason, and it's one of the ones that's harder to kind of make, just kind of hand wave, I suppose. Um, and also just for the Americans in the audience that may be confused by the reference to corn. Uh, Corn in an older English is really wheat. So it's, when he says corn, he's probably not referring to what most Americans would think of as the yellow sweet corn. That's a very different type of thing. Uh, but yeah, that one was to me one of the stronger ones. Do you have a particular piece of evidence that you think is kind of up there at the top?
Uh, concerning the darkening of the world by Melkor, I can also mention the essay Quendi and Eller, which mentions uh, the mists and the clouds darkening the sun and the stars during the war of the Valar with Melkor. So again, another reference in Quendi and Elder, as well as the Valarin names of the sun and moon, which must have been recorded before the exile. But so if I am to name any particular references which I think are most important, well, I could mention the latest ones. Um, the text about Círdan from last writings, so literally from the last year of Tolkien's life, um, describes Círdan standing at the shore of Beleriand and looking at the lonely isle in distance, and it is said that it was night, and later it is said from that night onwards, or the shibboleth of Feanor from presumably from 1968 or later, where again the new cosmology appears in the narrative fragment concerning the burning of the ships at Losgar, where it is said that Feanor aroused Kurufin in night, and then in the morning the host was mastered. Um, there is actually much of this stuff. For example, the description of the Naltalma, the Eldarin device used to make signals using the light of the sun and moon, which is said in later times to be ascribed to Feanor, but probably invented much, but probably being much older. Uh, there is much of this. I, I struggle to name the most important references without.
Right. Well, yeah, because there are several, and actually, I was going to ask you about the Círdan and Shibboleth of Feanor next if you didn't mention it, because to me those are some of the more pertinent ones. Because I mean, they explicitly reference things that don't make any sense without a sun and a moon, like the fact that there's a morning, the fact that there's you can reflect the light of sun and moon off of something. Those are terms that make zero sense. And again, if you really wanted to, you could say, well, Tolkien just wasn't thinking at the time about the fact that there was no sun and moon. He was, writing really late stuff and, probably old enough that he might have been forgetting things or whatever. But there's just so many of them over so many years. And let's not forget, too, some of these references, of course, you're talking about are from the Nature of Middle Earth, which is almost kind of like the History of Middle Earth, Volume 13 in a lot of ways. But a lot of this stuff is really late, but some of it is not so late. And you can track across a number of years the stuff that he's doing. And one of the things that is most kind of uh, maybe infamous about the Nature of Middle Earth is the huge amount of time Tolkien spends on how to make the Elvish population growth work. He's doing fairly complicated math in his late years, trying to be as precise as possible. So to write off any of these references as, well, he was getting old, he was forgetting stuff. He's still pretty sharp. I don't think we can really just, hand wave those kind of things away quite that easily. So yeah, I mean those are pretty significant. And I think the earliest piece of evidence that you mentioned, did it go all the way back to the 1940s, or am I messing that up? Do you remember what I'm talking about?
The earliest references to the round world, or should I say, the earliest texts reflecting this conception are such experimental writings. I think that at that time they were indeed experimental. They are the round world version, as Tolkien himself labeled it, of the Ainulindale, and the text named The Drowning of Anadune. Another um, version of the legend of the fall of Numenor. Yes, I think the drowning of Anadune in particular is very important because it is not just some note, it is an actual elaborated narrative existing in a few versions, which indeed reflects that the Earth was round from the beginning, and the later idea that it was flat and became round at the downfall, it is there explicitly presented as a managed belief which arose during the downfall. And if this text is dates from 1940s, this idea was also again reaffirmed by Tolkien much later in the in letter number 325 to Roger Lansling Green from 1971, where Tolkien describes the notion of the straight road and then proceeds to say that this idea lies behind the events of The Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion, but is not put forward as astronomically or geologically true, except that some special physical catastrophe is supposed to lie behind the legends, but the legends are mainly of Manish origin. So we can see that 3 decades less, some 2.5 decades later, Tolkien returned to this idea expressed in the drowning of Anadune. Um,
Yeah, and there's other stuff connected to Numenor too. Like you have references from the Mariner's Wife, or as many will know it, the Tale of Aldarion and Arendis. There's the interview he gave to I forget what's his name, but from the BBC, where he mentions that it was always a vast globe, which is where you kind of took the title for your paper from. Uh, there's a whole bunch of stuff, but rather than go into detail on all the different evidence, I do want people to actually read the paper because it's actually really well written. Um, but you mentioned, of course, the idea that this idea of a flat world cosmology was a mannish thing, and I mentioned that in my previous video too. That Tolkien was kind of using that as a way to fit everything together and not have to get rid of what he had already kind of established while still making it not really true. And the one, I think the one thing that makes me the most hesitant to kind of accept what Tolkien was doing here is the fact that it seems hard to believe that men, and in particular men in Numenor, who would have been the ones closest connected to the elves, who would have had the most, education from the elves and all this other stuff, could somehow get their mythology so completely wrong in basic respects like that. So I mean, it's not to say that it couldn't happen. I mean, obviously, lots of things can change and get corrupted over time. But do you have any particular thoughts on how you would go about explaining why Numenorian society, which seems like the one that would most accurately preserve, elvish knowledge, would end up with a totally radically different cosmology?
Yes, this is a very good question, and I indeed have something to say about this. First of all, in text one of Myths Transformed, we are clearly told that these Numenorian cosmogonic myths of the Silmarillion, confused with their own Manish beliefs, actually date back to the first stage, to the time when the Edain dwelt in Beleriand. So it these myths did not appear in Numenor, they appeared already in Beleriand. And also, this problem how the Numenorians could accept this as a myth, at least. It, a solution of, or rather an explanation of a sort is provided again in the drowning of Anadune, because it is said that the messengers of the Valar actually taught the Numenorians about the true fashion of the earth. There is a beautifully written passage there. I can recite it. And behold, the fashion of the earth is such that a girdle may be set about it, or as an apple it hangeth on the branches of heaven, and it is rounded fair, and the season lands about but the rind of the fruit which shall abide upon the tree until the ripening that Eru hath appointed. And despite the messengers teaching the Numenorians about this. This is a hard saying for men to believe. And also Sauron, in this text, Sauron gainsays the teaching of the messengers because Sauron advocates the flat earth belief because
Another quick correction. Instead of advocated, he intended to say propagated.
He uses it to urge the Numenorians to the conquest of these endlessly vast earth, as he presents it. But also, it is said in the drowning of Anadune that for these reasons. Few, even among the faithful, believed the teaching of the messengers, which, on the other hand, implies that there were some few who believed this teaching about the round shape of the earth. And also, there is a note which Christopher presents in his comments to the first text of Myths Transformed, which says the cosmogonic myths are Numenorian blending elven lore with human myth and imagination. A note should say that the wise of Numenor recorded that the making of a sun was not so, nor of stars and the making of stars was not so, nor of sun and moon, for sun and stars were all older than Arda. So again, the wise of Numenor, whoever they were actually aware of the cosmological truth which lay behind the myths. So yes, not all of the Numenorians were ignorant about this.
Yeah, and that's a good point. And you could even, if you wanted to, I don't know that Tolkien would have had this in mind writing when he did, but there are one of the interesting things about the internet is that it has allowed people with crazy opinions to make their opinions known publicly, and some of those people believe that there is a flat Earth even today. So my question was in some part rhetorical because obviously, even in a modern age with all the scientific advancements we have now, you still have people who say that the earth is flat. So it's obviously not impossible that a civilization like Numenor would have people like that. And it's also, as you point out, there were the wise in Numenor who knew better. And again, I don't necessarily think Tolkien was thinking in these terms because he probably wasn't aware that there were any flat earthers because he didn't have access to the internet. Um, but you could almost imagine him writing that passage in the modern day as almost a jab saying, guys, we've known since Ptolemy. People have known for thousands of years that the world is round, and you're still claiming this nonsense. So I mean, one can only wonder what Tolkien's actual reaction would be, but it's just funny how you can read stuff like that and look at what goes on in our own day, and it almost looks like Tolkien was writing for us, and even though he's writing almost a century ago now. It's crazy. So I don't want to take up too much more of your time. And like I said, I do want people to read the paper, and we've covered a good chunk of it here already. Uh, but to kind of bring it back to what I said early on about my own personal preference, my personal preference is I like the Silmarillion that we have published. I like that because it is a very different kind of world, and that's part of I think, the charm. Uh, what what is your personal preference? Do you like the Silmarillion cosmology better, or do you kind of wish that the Silmarillion had been published, with the round world cosmology behind it?
The thing is that I do think that the Silmarillion, as published in the regards to the cosmology, is what Tolkien himself would probably have published, because if after his acceptance of the new cosmology, there was indeed some time when he evidently intended to exclude the chapter of the making of the sun and moon, as seen in in Christopher Coleman's about the latest narrative work on the Silmarillion. But later, I believe, and it is not a new idea, it is also expressed, for example, by Charles Node in his essay on the construction of the Silmarillion. Tolkien decided to keep the old tales, the cosmogonic legends, under the idea of the managed transmission of the Silmarillion. We already mentioned it, and given at least the letter to Roger Lancelin Green, which presents at least the straight road as Manish believe, and this is from 1971. I think this was his final intention. So I do not think that he would have changed the actual narrative of the Silmarillion to reflect the new cosmology. But on the other hand, there is plenty of new texts, especially those that present elvish point of view, which do reflect the new cosmology. So for me, for myself, the Silmarillion does reflect the it does contain the myths of the making of the sun and moon, of the flat Earth becoming round, and I do not have any problems with this. But the reality in the background, for me, it is the originally round Earth and the sun and moon, which are coeval with the Earth. And I think it is not actually, it is not something bad that we have flat Earth mythical Silmarillion and the round Earth texts. I think that in this way we actually have we get what one person I talked with called the Multe perspective legendarium. So there are different peoples with different traditions. There are the high elves who are aware of the cosmological truth, and their texts reflect this truth. There are men with their own beliefs. So I think that this makes the legendarium as a whole only richer, more interesting, in my opinion. So
Yeah, well, and that's a a good note to end on. And that's, that's one of the things that Tolkien was actually really good at too, is the fact that, he came up with not only different kind of mythological backgrounds for all these different races and stuff, but the dwarves have their own specific beliefs about their origins, and the elves have their own kind of different views on that, and men are kind of a question mark in some ways, and they all have their own different backgrounds, cultures, and everything else. And he really does a good job of giving you something from each of them that is really true to what they are. It's not just three different races that are all written kind of the same. He really does give the impression of, elves tend to kind of just sit back and not do a lot because, and I don't remember where this reference is, but it's in one of the History of Middle Earth volumes. I'm sure of it, but something to the effect that because they don't have a short life, they can afford to wait, and so they aren't driven to action the way that men are. And he really thought out a lot of the psychology of what these different peoples would be like, and that's one of the interesting things about it is he really did spend the time. And again, that's one reason why I don't think you can really hand wave away a lot of the evidence that you've put into this article. So again, for all the viewers out there, do check out the article. He goes into a lot more depth than we've done here. He talks about some of the references in the Lord of the Rings that may lead you to reach the opposite conclusion, but still kind of explains them in ways that you can see why. Well, maybe that doesn't prove anything after all. So, and everybody can kind of come to their own conclusions. But I really want to thank you for your time. Like I said, I appreciate you sharing this with me, and I'm glad you wanted me to do a video on it, and I'm glad we could do this so that you could actually be involved, because I think it's uh, I just didn't really want to do it by myself, and I was going to give credit even if I did, but it just seemed kind of like stealing the glory a little bit. So I really appreciate that, and I hope you continue to put out really interesting work for both on the language side and anything else you come across. Because and one thing I wanted to mention too, nobody reading your paper would ever know that English was your second language. Like I said, it's really well written, and I mean, and it's downright eloquent at times. So, best of luck with everything you do, and I hope you continue to find really interesting and surprising things that the rest of us haven't caught.
Thank you very much for the invitation and for the kind words. I am also very grateful that you gave me the opportunity to talk here, to present my research to a large audience. Thank you very much.
All right, and with that, we will call this video to a close, everybody. Namaste. Thanks to all my channel supporters, especially elf friends Nathan Dufour and Robert Kindling.